Good afternoon. Welcome to The Art of the Lie, Global Perspectives on Fake News. I'd like to introduce the panel. The format will be that each of the panellists will talk for about 10 minutes and then we will open up the floor to questions. So keep your questions ready, write them down, do this whole journalistic thing and write them down, or type them into your iPhones or whatever. So our first panellist will be it's Aidan White. Aidan is the director and the CEO of the Ethical Journalism Network. He worked as a journalist with newspapers, many newspapers, including The Guardian, before taking up his post as the General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. He has written extensively on human rights and more recently migration and ethics, and he played a leading role in establishing the International News Safety Institute. In 2012, he founded the Ethical Journalism Network. Drew Sullivan, who's next to Aidan, is the Editor-in-Chief of the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Program, OCCRP, in Sarajevo. A former stand-up comedian and aerospace engineer, he worked on the space shuttle, before becoming an investigative journalist, under whose direction the OCCRP has won numerous European press prizes, the Daniel Pearl Award many times, Online Journalism Award, the Online Journalism Award for Investigative Journalism numerous times, the Global Shining Light Award, which is for young journalists, 5 times. Incredible. And the Tom Renner Award for crime reporting, and the Pulitzer Prize for their contribution to the Panama Papers. Andy Lehren is a former New York Times investigative reporter who specialises in data journalism. He mined the Snowden files, he probed WikiLeaks cables and contributed to the Pulitzer Prize-winning examination of the Chinese chemicals that tainted US pharmaceuticals, the substandard chemicals that tainted US pharmaceuticals. He has won the Polk, the Peabody, and 3 Investigative Reporters and Editors Awards. He teaches at the City University of New York and at Columbia University, and I'm going to sign up and be one of his students. He's amazing. So please welcome our panel. I'll just be very, very brief and make a couple of comments. When I was first asked to moderate this panel, I wondered about the title, The Art of the Lie. I mean, what does that mean? And is it fake news if you lie? Or is it just lying? Indeed, I recently heard someone say, there is no such thing as fake news, there is only news and that there's lying. I wonder what the panel have to say about that. But calling it an art, the art of fake news, suggests something clever, something creative. So I went back in time when I first heard the term fake news as an art form, and that was in Nazi Germany. The films of Leni Riefenstahl and the associated information in books, magazines and newspapers. They called the films art and the associated artistic comment, but were they fake news or was it propaganda? And indeed, is propaganda fake news? Let's ask the panel. Today, powerful digital tools are accessible to most of the world's population. In fact, 7.1 billion people could probably create fake news if they wanted to, or check it. And most of the world's population can spread fake news at lightning speeds throughout networked societies on social media. Yesterday, the Facebook man said he had 2 billion daily users. Interesting, all the numbers I can find suggest that the unique monthly figure is 2 billion and the unique daily figure is 1/3 less. Did I hear him wrong? Was he spreading fake news? Was it a mistake? Was it propaganda, or was it just the business of social media? Maybe we need to do some data mining to find out, and we'll ask Andy about that. As far back as 2008, Charles Feldman called this social media clickstream a tsunami. Just recently, Maria Ressa a brave journalist from the Philippines, called this flood of unreliable information a danger to democracy when she summed up the problem. If you have 10 lies, you can fix it. When you have a million lies, it becomes the truth. And therein lies the danger. Whether it's fake news, propaganda or lies, the real question is, how do we get to the truth? Thank you. Let's ask the panel. Aidan White first.
Thanks very much, Ivo. I'm going to sort of take what you've said and try to make a wider review of the sort of landscape that we're in. And I think that in order to talk about fake news, we have to place it in the context of information and how we use data. The reality is that data is today, it's the oil of the 21st century. Who owns it, who controls it, becomes immensely rich and powerful. Now, outside China, which has its own internet ecosystem, this digital goldmine, if you will, is really controlled by a handful of corporations, and we know who they are. They're Facebook and Google and Twitter and Amazon. And their work has helped to create a communications culture that is both liberating, but I would argue is deeply flawed, and one that requires urgent attention. Because opening the door to fake news is only merely one aspect of it. It's in this context, I think, that we need to state that, what is fake news and how does it emerge? You made a reference to someone, did they make a mistake or not? I mean, one of the most common mistakes that can be made is the idea that fake news is equal to bad journalism. It's not. That's Trumpism. It's Trump who points at people and says, you're fake news. Points at journalists or at networks he doesn't like, whose opinions he doesn't like, whose report he doesn't like, and says, that's fake news. He makes a criminal mistake, if you will, because his attempt to shame journalism calls into question probably one of the few streams of reliable and useful information that is still available on the internet. So when we talk about fake news, we have to be very clear what we're talking about. We're talking about the deliberate fabrication of information with the intention to deceive. And one of the important aspects of the information landscape in which we live these days is that this deliberate fabrication of information with the intention to deceive can make money and it can make politics. It's a business model that allows, for example, the famous Macedonian teenagers who were, in my view, skillful, useful, technically equipped and bright entrepreneurs who were able to recognize that by simply sitting down and making fictional accounts of news and information, they could make heaps of money, which they did, interfering in the presidential election that saw Donald Trump come to power. We see also the fact that we've got troll farms operating around the world that are used to silence alternative voices and allow the proliferation of misinformation on an enormous scale, which is beyond regulation and beyond control. We see the expansion of information capacity of unscrupulous politics, not just Russian trolls. Almost any extremist party, extremist right-wing party, racist party, terrorist group or whatever, they have the capacity to use the technology to intervene directly, to target people who are vulnerable people, to spread hatred and to be able to develop their own quite vicious form of politics. All of this leads to the undermining of democracy and election processes, because what we have is the capacity, and we've seen it in recent elections, not just in the United States election. We saw it in the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. We've seen it in almost every single national election that's taken place. One way or another, there has been an attempt to interfere with the democratic process through the insertion of unscrupulous fake information into the process. Indeed, Mark Zuckerberg, in his famous manifesto earlier this year, commented that it's important to note that in almost all recent elections, It has been the candidate who has had the highest number of followers on Facebook that has managed to win, which suggests that there's a correlation between your engagement with Facebook and your capacity to win elections, no matter where you are. And then besides all of this, there's the unlimited proliferation, which Maria was talking about, of abusive comment and so on. So I think we have to understand that this business model that we're dealing with, we need to understand, and it's the one that contributes to fake news. I mean, and what is the business model? The business model is based very simply on the idea that all streams of information are of equal value. That is to say, there is no distinction between pornography and terrorist hate speech or journalism. There is no distinction to be made between the work that's produced by our universities and our communities and forms of extremism and abuse. Because to the internet companies, and Facebook I think is the best example, they regard all of these streams of information as of equal value according to their business model. The only thing that matters is whether or not this stream of information attracts attention. If it attracts attention, it is able to generate automatically through algorithms and robotic systems advertising. And as a result of that, the whole question is built onto what clicks, what works, what grabs attention, what makes money. So at last, questions are being asked about how much of our information is under the control of these companies. And so it's a sensible question. For instance, why, for example, in democratic societies you have this sort of obvious statements to make. We don't build theatres without fire escapes. We don't build cars without safety belts. Why on earth do we allow an information system to be created which has power to do real damage without any safety nets being properly built in? So these questions at last are being asked about the question of damage control. So I would argue that in order to deal with fake news, we need to reshape and re-examine our information culture. And this requires a number of quite straightforward actions. I think there's a lot of debate now about how we rein in the power of the tech companies. They've overstretched themselves, they've overreached themselves. And there's a real danger, unfortunately, that we might see governments intervening more directly to impose laws and restrictions on technology companies because of their own failure to take responsibility for what they do. And that is potentially damaging to democracy. It's not something that we in particular, the Ethical Journalism Network, is going to say is good for pluralism, is good for democracy. But the sad fact of the matter is, unless companies like Google and Facebook are prepared to take their responsibility as publishers and to put in place mechanisms that will protect our systems of democracy, protect our systems and our information landscape from the toxic pollution that actually is taking place at the moment, then it is inevitable that there are going to be legal restraints imposed. Either there will be legal restraints or there will be new forms of public ownership introduced to try to control these systems. But my final point is really is to say this. It's not enough just to target and to blame the tech companies, although I have to say their capacity to make extraordinary amounts of money at the expense of journalism, as we have seen over the past and recent years, is shameless, and their lack of regard for that, it seems to me to be a betrayal of what democracy stands for. We also have to recognize that we, the users, are culpable in the process. It is we who have surrendered our privacy and our identity to these companies. It is we who have given them permission to use information about who we know, where we go, what we buy, how we live our lives, what our political thinking is, and allowed them to take it and then to exploit it for financial gain. So we have a massive problem. We have companies who provided mechanisms for our freedom, and we have our own capacity to surrender democratic values in order to gain these services. So we need two things. One, we need to get the companies to take more responsibility. Two, we need new systems for ourselves to learn how to use information better. We need new educational framework, and we also need not just to educate our children about how to navigate safely around the internet, we need to engage with corporate, civil, and political centers of power to get them to take responsibility, also to contribute to decent civil discourse and public communications. It's only when we begin to do that that I think we're going to really get down to tackling the dangers that are posed by fake news. Thank you.
We'll keep our questions to the end.
Can you hear me? Yes. So first of all, well said, Aidan. Many of your points I think are really important. A couple things. First of all, one thing I will disagree with you on, in Macedonia, we actually went and visited the teenagers in Velish, and their story about how they were creating clickbait to earn money as poor Macedonian teenagers was in fact fake news. And it was actually a very well-funded organization that appears to have gotten Russian money and was connected to the Macedonian intelligence organization. So, you know, even in that particular case, it's very difficult when you're dealing with spies and you're dealing with, you know, countries' propaganda efforts to get to the bottom. You know, the fake news that we've been seeing of late is essentially been propaganda. It is, I've lived under propaganda now for about 20 years, living in Sarajevo in Eastern Europe, where propaganda is a regular part of the political process, and we've been under Russian propaganda through their local television stations for some time. So we understand propaganda and we know what it is. What's really new is the distribution systems that Aidan was referring to. Propaganda is old. The new distribution systems are effective. And we're really dealing with almost a certain amount of chaos, because one teenager on Facebook can get their views of the world or their fake news or their propaganda distributed all over the world. And so it's an incredibly powerful tool that is now being harnessed effectively by a number of different organizations. And what makes it so effective is that, you know, we've trained people over the last 200 years to recognize a news story and to deem it credible. And they're using that training that we have done for so long to fool people, and fake news is getting the credibility that it should not get. The other thing that it's doing so effectively, it's mimicking the grassroots campaigns. Suddenly when 50 of your friends on Facebook send the same message to you, you think that this is a movement, and most people want to be part of a movement. They want to be on the right side of history. But what they might be having is 50 friends who are actually trolls, who are just gaming the system and making it look like they're in fact, you know, you're part of a movement. So the underlying commonality in all this is that essentially we were the gatekeepers at one time in history. You had to get news from us. We're no longer the gatekeeper. We're competing against everybody out there, and people have become more sophisticated at becoming gatekeepers themselves, or mimicking gatekeepers. So we're in this, in a sense, we're in this world of this digital cacophony, which is making it extremely difficult for people to understand. And the natural ramification of this is that people are no longer trusting media. They blame us as part of this fake news process. And that's the real danger there. We're essentially having to point the finger at people who resemble us and say they're fake and we're not. And that's really not a winning proposition in most cases. So we really need to rethink this whole process. In my part of the world, fake news or propaganda has been used largely to keep people content with the regimes. Every country has its own national mythology. Think about your own country and the mythology you have about your country. These are things that are beaten into our heads, they're ingrained in our heads. We're told all the time that we're great business people, or we're great pragmatists or something, that we love freedom. And these are essentially a form of propaganda. It's propaganda used for maybe a positive thing. It's to build cohesion. It's to build a sense of identity amongst a group of people. But it is essentially propaganda. And with this digital cacophony, when those basic premises are questioned and undermined, it makes it extremely difficult. But part of this process is often we create external enemies. We create the other that we can compete against, and that's what you see in a lot of these cases of inaccurate information. It's creating enemies, it's creating bad people, it's creating an other that we need to fight against. And through this process, this information has been weaponized. It's now actually part of most countries to have what they call psychological operations, part of their intelligence agency. And I think if you haven't seen it as much in your region, you will see it in the near future. I think people have realized the power of these tools, and they're going to use them more effectively against audiences or subsets of audiences. So what do we do about it? Well, first of all, we can't allow misinformation to sit out there for long periods of time. We must respond with the truth. You never want to repeat fake information. You never want to repeat, because each time you repeat it, it actually becomes stronger. And they found in studies that were done that whenever news organizations pointed out fake news stories, it actually helped the fake news story embed itself in the collective consciousness of the people. So the story about the Pope supporting Donald Trump is now believed by a certain percentage of the population in the United States, even though it was completely fake. But the fact that so many news organizations repeated this story and raised questions on it led to people thinking that in fact this is the truth. So you don't ever want to repeat the information. We want to forewarn the population about things. When information we know is coming that is going to be wrong, we want to tell people that there's going to be misinformation out there, and that they're going to have to be very careful what they believe on a particular issue. So probably be very important around election times. We want to isolate the practitioners. We want to constantly identify those news organizations and identify them as uncivil society, the bad guys, the people that are seeking to mislead. And we need to make that very clear in our stories and our news. But those are the obvious first steps, but there's a deeper step I think we all need to take, and that's really reinvention of investigative reporting in particular, but journalism in general. We're using the same format from hundreds of years ago. It's a two-dimensional, event-driven story that's typically either printed in a newspaper or slapped up on a screen. But that takes away so much of our power and so much of our information. We often have incredibly rich information that we're using. We have databases, we have interviews of hundreds of people who we might have done before a story. We have background information, we have context, we have all this stuff. And we don't provide that information to readers. We don't give them the depth of the information that we have. That's a very credible amount of information. Secondly, we don't show them the process of fact-checking. At OCCRP, we're working on a system that we can actually embed our fact-checking that we use into the story so that readers can go through and they can actually follow along and see the fact-checking, which helps give readers that sense that this is a substantial work and that there's credibility. Fake news doesn't have these elements. It can't have these elements. It was just made up. There is no proof. And so consequently, I think we need to find a way to capture that depth and richness in our stories. And then finally, I think media has always been a commercial model. That model, especially for investigative reporting, is fading. And I think we have to look at what new models there are. And we believe that there's a journalism commons out there that people can, that we should be connected to the public, that we should not be separate as a separate company or a separate organization. We should be embedded with the public, doing news with them. So we have to investigate new ways of how we're going to work with the public directly on helping them tell the stories about what's going on in their world. So I think there really is a massive rethinking of how journalism fits into society. We are a public service. We're a public service that's wrapped in a commercial entity. That entity may not survive. There's talks in Silicon Valley of the how we've reached peak advertising, and that even Google and Facebook will suffer in the future from peak advertising, because advertisers know to go directly to they're using these whole methods themselves to reach their audiences. So anyway, this is all part of the process I think we need to rethink, because otherwise this problem is going to dog us for years to come.
Thank you, Drew. And Andy, please.
Right. Well, at this point, I'm so depressed I don't know whether I should go on or not. I certainly agree with just about everything Drew and Aidan have been saying. There's a lot of truth to so much of what's been discussed. One point when Aidan was talking about tech companies profiting at the expense of journalism, I don't think this can be underestimated. I think one of the big problems we face, and I say this as a reporter who's been trying to encourage and promote investigative reporting in the United States and around the world, is that the loss of revenue is taking away the lifeblood, so that we can be training future investigative journalists or nascent investigative journalists here at conferences like this, but they need a place, they need outlets where they can do their work. And when so much of that has been taken away, it really leaves us scrambling. Among the companies you mentioned, fortunately, Bezos has been funding and caring for the Washington Post and doing a great job with that. But there's no doubt that Facebook, Twitter, Google have really taken away a lot. And what's particularly tragic is that maybe national news organizations have been able to weather the storm, but the real damage we've been seeing is at the local and regional level. Those news organizations have been decimated. And as Drew's talking about finding new models, whether it's nonprofits, whether it's some kind of consortiums or synergies, there's no doubt that one of the biggest needs we're going to be facing is at the local and regional level. One of the things that I'd like to talk about in particular, at this point, there's an old serenity prayer that's out there. It's like, you hear all of this, like, grant, and the part that I'll latch onto right now is the part of that prayer that says, grant me the serenity to to deal with the things that I can control or do something about. So I assume at this point most of the audience here are journalists. So I want to talk to you guys about what you can do, because day in and day out, it's what we do as journalists that I think separate us from the rest of what's out there, whether it's propaganda, whether it's fake news. And so, what are some of the hallmarks of fake news? Very often it's stories that rely on attribution of a single source, a single quote. So-and-so says it's outrageous that this occurs. Sometimes when you're reading fake news, it's playing on a misunderstanding how government or politics work. You'll see fake news in the United States that will, say, according to court documents, and it'll be in a court that doesn't even exist. And so you'll look at the other thing too that's interesting about fake news, and Drew kind of touched on it a little bit, which is the idea that all of a sudden there'll be a rush of information of a story you never heard about, often with the headline of bombshell, new information revealed. So these things all have certain kind of characteristics. Where you can check the timelines of things. You can check for whether there are fake followers or fake, retweet, people who are allegedly, following you on Twitter, or who are your friends who don't even exist. They're essentially bots out there, machines. And so how do we convince people that, what we have is real? So one of the things that's, if there's any silver lining in all of this, whether it's been at the New York Times or now with my new job at NBC News, is that it's really clear is that the audience in America and around the world has a huge appetite for real news. When we do a story, whether it takes us months or perhaps years to report, you can see that people want this. So if you're ever deep in the weeds of an investigative story and you're wondering, like, is there really an audience there? I can tell you every viewership, every readership number I've seen on almost every story I've done, the audience is there for this. And they recognize the difference between this and ephemeral news, something that's fleeting. So if you're, as I'm going to talk more about how you go about digging into a story, I just want you all to know that there is a need and a desire and a hunger out there for this kind of information. So how do you go about getting this information? One of the things that we talk about a lot at investigative conferences like this is the verifiable truth. If someone says something, if a government asserts something, how do we know that it's true? How can we verify it? And there's all different ways to go about verifying information. While social media is being used against us to undermine some of the credibility of our reporting, you can also use social media to verify information. You can do things like geolocate how bits of information are flying out there. You can do things like examine videos and examine texts, and you can see where was this really done. A gentleman yesterday from Bellingcat was doing a great job of showing how you can mine social media to verify information and how every fact is crucial. The sad reality is that pretty much journalists are the ones who end up doing this kind of work. This is the value added that we bring to the digital internet age, is us digging. So digging into social media and flipping the equation, that's certainly helpful. But then there are all the traditional ways that we talk about doing our reporting. I just spent 4 hours in my previous session talking about how you can mine data and documents to verify and find stories. If you hear rumors about something, someone says, oh, the US military is doing this or the spies are doing that, there's a lot of information out there where you can actually verify whether it is true. It takes work, it takes digging, but there are ways to do this. So I encourage you, when you're at conferences like this, again, what are the things that I can control? What are the things that I can do? You can go get training. How do I go and get public documents? How do I get documents that I can verify? How do I analyze and read documents carefully to pull out the bits of information that have gone uncovered, that have gone unexamined, that readers and viewers don't know about? This is incumbent on us to go and do. Data, we talked about data. I know that, Drew and others here have certainly mucked about in data. It's not easy sometimes to work with data, but it's not impossible. You guys can learn it relatively quickly. Learning how to use a spreadsheet like a ninja only takes a couple days to get the basics down. A database software, a little bit more time. Some mapping software, maybe a little bit more time, but it's not out of reach. It's not like learning a whole brand new language. It's something you're all very familiar with. So I would encourage you when you're at events like ARIJ or other global investigative reporting conferences to go and just spend a little bit of time learning some of these skills, because it's these kinds of skills, when we bring this kind of heft to our journalism, that the viewers and readers really do notice the difference. And if there's anything to be thankful for about all of this is, I go around in this conference and you can meet a journalist, from Libya, from Morocco, who's been imprisoned. So there are worse things that you can do to a journalist than just, deluge the world with fake news, But in democratic and countries that have a veneer of democracy, the tool that's being used against us is fake news. So the best weapon that we have against it is to just really do good journalism day in and day out. And I do know that this will be recognized by our audiences. So with that,
Good.
Ivo, yeah.
Yeah, great. open it to the floor for questions. Does anybody have? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Fatima from Syria, and I have a comment and a question at the same time. I mean, Mr. Aidan was very much focusing on the role of Facebook and Google and their responsibility in disseminating fake news. I actually think and believe that this is a platform, just like, let's say, any other media outlet that's offering a platform for people to express their opinion. So how can I expect, let's say, from Facebook or Twitter to actually maybe censor those kind of opinions? In the same time, I see a very prominent journalist writing in the New York Times, for example, an article about Saudi Arabia and how it's like the Arab Spring has finally reached Saudi Arabia. So how is this different? Why does Facebook have a responsibility towards that, and the New York Times doesn't have a responsibility, for example, towards that? Thank you.
I think the New York Times does have a responsibility. It's a publisher. And the New York Times has a responsibility because the way it works and the way that it does its work is based on a framework of values. And those values are civic values, they're democratic values, they're well understood. Anyone in journalism knows what those values are. And if they get it wrong, they say we're sorry. And sometimes they go to extraordinary lengths to say we're sorry. When one of their reporters was found guilty, famously a few years ago, of fake news on a grand scale, they actually commissioned a massive investigation and then published, goodness knows why they did it, but they published 3, 6, 12,000 words of mea culpa about what they'd done and what was wrong. And what was important about that is exactly the distinction that I think we need to make about publisher responsibility and the responsibility of groups like Facebook and Google and so on, because they don't have that sense of civic values. And they only take that sense of civic values when they're told to, when there are protests by advertisers en masse, or when there are protests by governments. Then they listen, then they sit up and take notice. The fact of the matter is we all have various visions of how our democracy should function and how a civilization should work. And so we protect our children. We protect ourselves from terrorism. We try to sort of protect all sorts of things. When those are being called into question by platforms that recklessly allow organizations and groups that challenge all of these values without any attempt to effectively to restrain them voluntarily, then I think we've got a big problem. It is not censorship to say we don't want pedophiles to benefit from access to information which is potentially damaging to our children. It is not censorship to say that we want to function in our democracy by registering a vote without having false news interfering with the process. So I think I disagree with you very strongly in trying to sort of suggest that an attempt to bring these platforms into line with normal democratic standards is a form of imposing censorship. I reject that completely.
My name is Mohammed Fadel. I am from Bahrain. The question is for the three colleagues there. How would you define stereotyping in this regard? I mean, in creating fake news or helping in spreading fake news. As from a little experience, I found out that sometimes, or most of the time, the fake news are based on a stereotype idea. And part of it, it's based on that. So my question again, just to be clear, how would you define stereotyping in this regard? Thank you.
Well, stereotyping is just one of the tools that's used in fake news. I mean, simplification of complex problems. You know, it all depends on what you're trying to do. But you know, the core point here is that somebody purposely wants to deceive you. It's not that it's sloppy journalism. It's not that it's stereotyping. It's somebody wants to deceive you and they will use stereotyping and other tools and other prejudices that people have in order to empower their story. And that's really the fundamental problem here. You create, as I said, you create an other, you create hate, you create anger, you usually create some, most fake news is based usually on some kind of grievance that a group of people have, and they play on that grievance, and they push the buttons on the grievance in order to get people to feel emotional, and once they feel emotional, they're less logical about it, and that's kind of that's the basis of propaganda.
Yeah, baby up there. Thank you.
يعطيكم العافية. أنا صلاح من فلسطين. ممكن الإشارة كانت ممكن مش واضحة كثير لحاجة ممكن نسميها في الإعلام التأطير الأخبار framing news. مثل يعني اجتزاء النصوص، وهذا ممكن كثير من المؤسسات التقليدية بتعمله، مش بس لا فيسبوك ولا تويتر ولا غيره، فهم بيعملوا بعتقد جزئية كبيرة منه بتظهر من خلال تأطير الأخبار، اجتزاء النصوص والصور، استبعاد بعض الأجزاء من الأخبار، إطلاق بعض المصطلحات ما بين ثورة أو ربيع عربي أو انقلاب. يمكن لاحظنا هذا الكلام في تغطية ما حصل في مصر في 30 يونيو، ما عرفناش إحنا بالضبط كيف كان موقف المؤسسات، جزء منها كان يقول هذه ثورة وجزء الآخر كان يقول انقلاب، وكله في الآخر يعني في النهاية ضمن يعني السياسة التحريرية. شكرا.
I think Aidan, the glossary, who was it directed to? No, anybody? Anybody on the... yeah, maybe Aidan.
You're absolutely right. Framing news is one of the problems, and we have a great deal of difficulty. One of the things I think we are agreed with on this panel is, well, there are two things we agree with. One is journalism's important, and secondly, we have to find a way of how we can strengthen it. And the issue that you've raised, it calls into question the way that journalism is sometimes used deliberately, if not openly, to carry a certain political message, to reaffirm certain prejudices and ideas and thoughts. And it's true. I think we have to re-examine how news is produced. It's always very important, though, to bear in mind that the good journalism is always sensitive to its audience. It understands its audience. It engages with the audience. It doesn't lie to the audience, but it respects the customs and traditions and values of the audience. I think that's an extremely important part of journalism, being connected to the people that it serves. And it's very difficult sometimes for some journalists not to stray into that business of framing a story in order to carry a sort of a certain sort of political message. It's something that actually requires us to constantly reflect and retrain ourselves on. And we, in the Ethical Journalism Network, are constantly sort of saying, look, there are core values of journalism. You need to sort of constantly think about how do you put them into effect. We help to produce glossaries and ways of identifying hate speech, of asking journalists to think clearly before they use words, and what are the impact of those words, and how can those words be used and twisted, and so on. There is terminology constantly that we have to re-examine and how we use it. And the difficulty about all of that, which has to be done, and it's part of strengthening journalism, the difficulty about all of it is that there's a rush to publish. Journalists are encouraged very often in difficult circumstances to publish their information very quickly without time for reflection and looking at alternative ways of putting things and so on. And that's why we need much more support through glossaries and education and training and so on, so that journalists better understand the issues before they rush to publish in very often a very sometimes biased way.
I would also add that for us journalists in the field, what's important when you're doing your piece is to help provide some of that context. So the context could be, well, other people have reported a little bit before on this subject, and here's how we're advancing the story. You tell the reader essentially like what's the value added, what's the additional information you're providing here. It could be you're doing an investigation that has never seen the likes of you know, the public has never seen the likes of it before, in which case you need to say, you know, try to make that clear as well. But providing context and doing it carefully is one of the things we do, in addition to gathering up all the information. So the issue of framing a story is nothing I've ever seen taken lightly in the pieces that I've worked on. And it can be every bit as laborious. You're trying to figure out exactly what it is that you're providing the reader. But I think it's important to have at least a paragraph or two or part of your broadcast to say, here's really why you need to pay attention to this particular bit of reporting.
That a lot of the media around the world does a very poor job covering other countries. The American media does a very poor job covering the Middle East. They do not understand the Middle East, and because of the cuts in the newsroom and cuts in foreign offices, these media don't have the people in the field, and so they make some very basic mistakes that you might interpret as fake news. But you know, there's a difference between bad journalism and fake news, and let's keep that in mind.
Maybe here and then over there and then over there and then over there.
Hello, I am Ahmed Baidar, freelancer and journalist fixer from Yemen. I just want to tell you, you know, the situation in Yemen is so different. What we are talking about, as usual, we're explaining to people. I just want to say, you know, sometimes, for example, once I was, you know, there was a big explosion in Yemen, and you know, everyone just talk and says fake news about what's going on. I mean, after that, you know, like if you heard about the urinal hole attack. So anyways, everyone, you know, unfortunately, main media, Arabic outlets also says, oh, everyone says it's a terror attack and it's I don't know what and blah, blah, blah. But it was an airstrike, and I went there with ITV News, a British outlet, and we showed the world that this was, you know, this attack was from airstrike. So from your experience, can you share with us how to produce accurate news and how to work, you know, with the professional, you know, journalism way?
Well, one thing you can do is if there's a question on an explosion, is to immediately go and visit the place where the explosion took place and talk to the witnesses. You know, it is not unusual that there was a Russian fake news site that set up a explosion in Houston, Texas that never existed. There was no explosion, but they convinced a large number of people that there had been an explosion. And this seemed to be some kind of game they were playing to see how far they could go with it. But it took some time before people realized it was not an explosion. In these types of cases where there is an explosion, you know, you have to really actually physically go there and do what you typically do in journalism. Interview all the witnesses, what exactly happened, what did you see, what did you hear, you know, and then report something that's different than what the other media is doing. That's the power of you know, fake news or misinformation, is that you can, you know, journalists are covering the story from Doha or someplace else, and they never come out to see it, and they don't do the work that they need to do, and they have to get the news very quickly, so they rely on information that's wrong. But once that first information goes out that's wrong, it stays wrong in people's mind, many people's mind, for a long, long time. So you just have to do the old-fashioned journalism, which is go interview, check the records, whatever somebody says. The old saying is, you know, if your mom, for journalists, if your mom tells you she loves you, you better check it out. You know, that's what you should do. You don't believe any sources, including the government sources, until you get it.
Aidan.
There you go.
Is it? There it's working. It's okay. It's working. It's not that. Look, regarding the Yemen, I mean, I think one of the problems about Yemen is there are many problems, but this is a forgotten war in many respects. And one of the reasons for it is because of what we were talking about earlier, the lack of capacity of media to actually be able to report on foreign affairs. It's become a forgotten war. The tragedy for journalists inside Yemen is actually staying alive. hardly their capacity to sort of get the story. We've heard earlier about, for example, the Bellingcat example about using new technologies to be able to verify and trace, you know, when there are explosions and what happens and so on. But that can hardly be done by journalists inside Yemen. I mean, and this is one of the sort of difficulties. This is where the international community of journalists has a really specific responsibility. If we want to know the truth about what's happening in Yemen, we need to have journalism to get access to it and be able to sort of verify what's going on. Unfortunately, we don't have that capacity, or that capacity is much reduced. Now, that's a big problem, not just for journalists in the Yemen, but for journalism everywhere.
To add to it, I mean, you're right that international journalists do have a responsibility. So first, to address a little bit more, you know, there are ways to verify and check information. You know, there are experts who examine satellite photos and can say, right, well, this is not a small blast, this is not someone wearing a vest, this is something more significant. On the ground reporting, like Drew mentioned, you get the shards of information that may tell you whether it was Russian made or US made or where that weapon came from. So there are ways to, again, to get to the verifiable truth. There are techniques and experts who could help you. But to speak to Aidan's point as well about international reporting, I mean, I know that Drew, through his work at OCCRP, I mean, and myself being here, you know, just leaving the New York Times, now at NBC News, I mean, there is a desire and hunger to work with reporters and try to get this right. So we recognize that there is a need for us to work with you. So we're here in part to say, you know, partnerships, we're open to them. And if there's ways we can help or work together, we're open to it. And there are many Western journalists who want to do this.
Yeah, somewhere here, I think, was the next.
كما ذكرتم بأن الأخبار الملفقة أصبحت تستحوذ على مساحة واسعة في وسائل الإعلام وخصوصا وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي، لكن الكارثة أيضا تكمن في الأخبار التي تحمل جزء من الحقيقة وجزء أيضا من التضخيم والمبالغة. كيف نسمي هذه الأخبار وكيف يمكن التعامل معها والتمييز بينها وبين الأخبار الملفقة؟ شكرا.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things we have to do is we have to sort of pay attention to the fact-checking industry. The fact-checking and verifying information is actually one of the cardinal principles of good journalism. So we need to be able to try to verify information. And there is now much more engagement in fact-checking and so on. But the problem is, with the conspiracy theories that tend to be and have been generated very often on the net, we find that even fact-checkers are called into question and actually are themselves abused as being part of the process of fake news and so on. So it's an enormously difficult problem. The difficulty about it that we have is the people who want to use fake news for either corporate or political interests are very sophisticated in using the technologies to their own advantage and so on, and therefore will see the advantage of causing confusion by having some information which is palpably true and other information which is completely untrue and so on. And that mixing of the truthful and the malicious lie is actually one of the sort of biggest challenges that you have, not just for fact checkers but for anyone working in journalism.
أحمد حاج حمدو من سوريا. هلا أنا كنت بدي أحكي على نقطة هي العلاقة بالسوشيال ميديا. أنا برأيي هلا إذا لغينا الفيسبوك وتويتر نهائياً وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي كلها ما بنحل مشكلة الأخبار الملفقة. يعني اللوم بشوف إنه وضع اللوم عليها بشكل كامل هو أمر خاطئ. لأنه على التجربة الإعلامية يعني مثلاً في هلا وسائل إعلام حالياً عم تحجز دومين على الويب وتعمل .net وويب سايت وموقع، وفي بعض وسائل الإعلام عم تعمل مجلات. فهو بيكون الشخص هو عنده شركة عقارات أو شركة بيوت أو شركة سيارات، فبيقول إنه أنا ممكن إني أعمل ويب سايت بنشر أخبار أيا كانت تكن، وممكن أنا أسوق للمشروع اللي عندي. الأمر اللي بعزز هذا الشيء هو انه الحكومات والانظمه العربيه ما بتهتم للاخبار الشائعه، بتهتم للاخبار اللي ممكن تهاجمها او وسائل الاعلام اللي ممكن تاذيها او تضر بمصالحها. فبينما اذا على اي ارض يعني فتح موقع وصار يعطي اخبار شائعه فبيتركوه ما بيعملوا شيء، لانه هذا ما عم بياثر عليهم. شكرا.
I mean, just to be very clear, and I'll wait till you're ready. Thanks very much. Look, I've got a very strong view about how I think platforms need to be responsible. The last thing I want to see is the elimination of platforms or the elimination of social media. I think it's potentially the most liberating and important piece of human development that there has been in the last 50 years, without a doubt. The capacity and potential for progressive change has been enormously enhanced because of social media and so on. What I'm drawing attention to is the need for some form of regulation, that we eliminate from this process, an entirely liberating process, we eliminate as best as we can. We can't do it totally, but we eliminate as best as we can that which is potentially destructive to our social order and to our democracy and so on. And so therefore, I mean, don't misinterpret what I'm saying. I'm not in favor of moving backwards. I'm very much in favor of embracing fully social networks and technology and making the best of it we can. It's just that I don't think we've got the architecture right at the moment.
Drew? Just one thing to consider also is, you know, we're now looking at one version of technology, but the next level of technology is going to be very different, and it's going to use artificial intelligence, and eventually they will have bots that will be able to argue with you, and you will not be able to tell it's a human being. And they will use all your Facebook postings and your Google searches and everything to create creative and compelling arguments that are directed at you personally to convince you of something. And when we start getting to that level, it's going to be much more difficult to do a good story and counter that. So we really need to think about these issues now.
Drew, you talked about feeding the distribution systems earlier, and you talked about working with citizens, and that's kind of, to me, it smacks of education. How do you go about doing that?
You know, we're all constantly working we need to educate the public on the difference between good news and bad news. We need to educate the public on, you know, what they can trust, what they can't trust, and this has to be really done by media itself. You know, people talk about using public education campaigns, but it's very hard to go and train 9 billion people. You know, media itself must take on this responsibility of educating. We still have credibility. We need to use this credibility to help people educate them on these types of issues and what to look out for, what to avoid, you know, what's credible information, what's not credible information, and how to sniff out some of this bad information.
Andy, you teach at CUNY and Columbia. To what extent does education have a role in this?
Oh, education is huge. I mean, you're talking about not just educating the journalists, but also people who read and consume news. So making sure they understand that they can help recognize what has all the elements, the hallmarks that we're talking about. It's incredibly important. Yeah.
Yeah. One more, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah. Somewhere? Yeah, sure. This man here, I think, was waiting.
Thank you. I have a comment about the question of fake news. Maybe the question should be asked is why people consume fake news in the first place. And it seems to me that saying because they like that or because it's they are overwhelmed with them on Facebook is not enough. Maybe the answer might be that because simply they do not trust the traditional media or even the new media. And we saw that in the United States. I mean, the whole media landscape was shocked after people voted for Trump. And it turned out that big media organizations like New York Times and Washington Post cut the budget for their offices in the inner cities, and people there left behind. And because they left behind, they do not trust the mainstream media, and they are looking for alternatives. And they simply they are the victims for fake news. And I think this happens here in Jordan. It's a small country, yet you have some cities in the southern part of the countries. People are marginalized and they do not see themselves in the mainstream media. And because of that, they would be victims for the fake news. They would turn into some alternative sources of news that might tap into their, embedded racism or whatever.
Do we have a question?
It's just a comment. I said that.
I think you make a very good point. You're making 2 points. One, people read fake news because it's clickbait. It's really interesting, Israeli soldier kills, 2 young children just to see them die. Oh, I want to read that story. That reinforces a prejudice that you have, and people want that. But the second point you make, I think, is very valid. And if you look, American newspapers that relied on advertising increasingly went to wealthier audiences, and to the point where the New York Times is not read by taxi drivers, and it's not read by people in the streets. It's read by a particular group of people. And we as media, chasing those advertising dollars, did give away a significant part of our audience, which is the inner city, rural, working poor. And this is true all over the world. This is happening more and more. And that was a very, very dangerous mistake on our part. And we are no longer educating and no longer working with large parts of our audience. And that's a real problem that we need to fix, because it is bad. And that is one of the reasons, which I think you're right, that people discounted a lot of what the media had to say regarding Trump. And Trump was very effective at playing on that and using that to predict how the media would react to things, and they, of course, did. So it's a very good point.
I hope that, yeah. That really seems to me, you pose the critical question is, all of us on this panel have said it one way or another, that journalism is important and journalism needs to be strengthened, and actually that people want it. And it's true. People do and will trust journalism. The point about it is the way that journalism works at the moment is not reaching people in the way that will convince them that they need to go back to journalism. So we need to reinvent what we do. We need to make it more efficient. We need to make it more ethical in the way that it works, and so on. And we have to therefore work hard to try to regain people's trust. But in order to do that, we're going to need more resources. We're going to need more money invested in journalism and how it's done. And that's a massive challenge, because although there are various ideas about how we can create niche markets and find funding, in the end we're going to have to find massive funding from outside the traditional marketplace in order to be able to get journalism to function. Investigative journalism is fantastically important. Most of the investigative journalism in the world today that is organized through organizations like your own is very often funded by donors and foundations and so on, not by the market itself. We have to recognize this is a completely new landscape in which we're working, and we've got to ask some hard questions about how do we find the resources to make journalism work, which people will then be able to trust.
Can we have a little sum up from Drew and a little sum up from Andy, please? Andy. What's your final tip?
So I would encourage everyone here, if you are, all the journalists here, please, if there's one thing you can do, it's go and get training. Try to keep furthering your skills. And when you are deep in a story, please know that there are resources out there. One of the things about these conferences is that you create networks of people you can call and email. I'm having trouble with this. How do I get this document there? How do I verify this? We are all in this together, and as journalists, particularly those of us who come to these conferences, we want to share and work with you all. So we learn from you, you can learn from us maybe. Please take advantage of this. Use these events as opportunities to further skills. I know that's why I come here as well. So please go and do that, because that will make our reporting more valuable. And as we talk about fake news, it's the products that we'll be producing, the news that we'll be producing, the more solid that is, the more we can do to regain that public trust. I think you need to all go back to your newsroom and have a serious conversation about
about the credibility of your content, your investigative reporting, and how do you get more of your findings into the paper? How do you give the background and the information that you've collected into your story? How do you find a way to make your news more credible?
Thank you. All right, let's thank our panel. That's it, I think. Thank you very much. Well done, guys.